Welcome to Slow American English, the podcast for learners of American English. I'm your host, Karen Tolliver. This is episode number 50, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Before we begin, I have some good news. The fourth Slow American English workbook is now available on Amazon. Like the first three workbooks, this workbook has all the transcripts, bonus material, exercises, and answer keys for all the podcast episodes for an entire year. This Volume 4 contains all episodes from 2018, and it's available in print and Kindle formats. You can use each workbook either with the podcast or without it. Teachers can use it for listening and reading comprehension and discussion. Students can use it for self-study. For links to buy all my workbooks, visit www.slowamericanenglish.net. Also, many thanks to my Patreon patrons for pledging a small amount every month to keep the podcast going. Your contributions help pay for web hosting and other expenses. Without you, I could not produce this podcast every month. Thank you. To become a patron, visit www.patreon.com/slowamericanenglish. It's very inexpensive and helps everyone around the world who listens to this podcast. Become a website subscriber for free at www.slowamericanenglish.net. Find free transcripts there, plus links to become a patron and to buy workbooks. Subscribe to the podcast feed via Apple Podcasts, Android, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, and any other RSS feed reader. Contact me directly via email at info@slowamericanenglish.net. Now for the podcast. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of America's greatest leaders. He was an African American born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929. He was smart and well educated, entering college at age 15 and earning a doctorate from Boston University. He was also a pastor at a church in Alabama. I mentioned him in podcast episode 2, Black History Month. When King was born, racism, segregation, and discrimination were legal. This means that Black people and other minorities could not enjoy the same quality of life as whites. Things like hotels, hospitals, restaurants, and schools were segregated or separate, and the places for Blacks were usually in very bad condition. Blacks could not buy houses in certain areas. They were often prevented from voting, and they could not get good jobs. King himself attended segregated schools. In the 1950s and 60s, Dr. King and others led a nonviolent movement against segregation and legal discrimination. It was called the Civil Rights Movement. There were many protests and demonstrations, especially in the South. Dr. King was part of or led many important civil rights protests and demonstrations. During the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott of 1955 and 56, Dr. King's house was bombed, and he and 89 others were arrested. In 1957, he helped form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, whose goal was to achieve full equality for African Americans through nonviolent protests. About 250,000 Blacks and other civil rights workers gathered in Washington, D.C. in 1963. They held a protest against discrimination and segregation called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. In it, he called for an end to racism using emotional and poetic language. Repeating the phrase, "I have a dream," he stated his hope for equality and peace. In 1963, he was arrested during a protest in Birmingham, Alabama. There, he wrote his Civil Rights Manifesto, Letter from the Birmingham Jail. The letter tells exactly why he and his group were doing what they were doing. In 1965, during the first of 3 marches from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, King helped lead a group of about 600 civil rights protesters. Police attacked the marchers and beat and hurt many of them badly. The protesters had to go to court to win the right to march again, which they did a short time later. The civil rights movement was successful in some important ways. Because of the courage of the people in it, laws were passed that made discrimination and segregation illegal. Much of the success is due to Dr. King's leadership. In 1968, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He was only 39 years old. However, King's legacy of working for equal rights for everyone continues today, and he is recognized as a world leader. Now there is an official federal holiday on the 3rd Monday of January honoring him and his contributions to Americans. That's the podcast for this time. Slow American English is written and produced by Karen Tolliver. Copyright 2019. All rights reserved. For a free transcript and to subscribe to the podcast, visit www.slowamericanenglish.net. You can also subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, TuneIn, and any other podcast feed reader. Theme music for this podcast is written and performed by S.W. Campbell and used by permission. Find more music by this artist at www.soundclick.com/SWCAMPBELL. This has been Slow American English. I'm Karen Tolliver. Thank you for listening.